add my thanks to the Daughtry family for establishing this series of lectures, and I'm very honoured to be part of that string of illustrious speakers. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say a bit about, well, what is cybercrime then? What is the problem we're actually dealing with here? I'm going to say a bit about how we are seeking to respond to cybercrime. Then I'm going to talk about, well, what does that mean in terms of partnership, and in particular partnership with the business community, because we really can't do this without the business community. And then I'm going to leave you with some questions that I have for the academic research community, because this is a really difficult job and we need the brains that universities and other research institutions can bring to help us solve this problem. Great. Okay, this is what we call the pyramid of pain. This is a very simple way of describing what is the cybercrime problem that's facing the United Kingdom today. I've described it here at 3 levels. So we do have a problem of volume. When the Office of National Statistics did a small survey last year, they asked a sample of 2,000 people, which as statisticians within you here will say is not a very large number, but they extrapolated from that 2,000 and estimated that there were 2.5 million instances of cybercrime in the United Kingdom in the year 2015-16. Now, can I just check, because that's not a very big sample size, so I always ask every audience I talk to, who in this room has had experience of a cybercrime, as a victim that is, or a family member who's been subject to a cybercrime. So if you look at the hands that go up, that suggests that 2.5 million is not far off in terms of the volume. Now, there's some work, and David was involved in this, in saying, well, what actually does that consist of? And that was based on some statistics from Action Fraud, which is the single police reporting function for cybercrime and other sorts of fraud. And there was quite a wide variety of things. Some of it you could say is trivial. Social media takeovers, for example. But of course that's not trivial for the individuals concerned. Some of it was clearly not trivial, with people losing very, very significant amounts of money, and sometimes life-changing amounts of money, £100,000, £200,000, businesses going bust and so on. So that number, 2.5 million, covers a huge variety, but it impacts on a lot of people, and sometimes that impact is very, very serious. And I'll come on to what we're doing about that shortly. The tragedy is, of course, most of those crimes don't really hit the headlines. But what we have is a number of ones which really have hit the headline big time. And I've listed some of those. I think people will be familiar with most, if not all, of the ones I've listed. And that's really the tip of an iceberg last year. I did this slide actually in March, early March. We reckon there were about 140 incidents that required some kind of level of national response or national support. Just to give you an idea of the cut-off point, I've named some well-known, indeed one notorious incident. I could have included Norwich Airport and Lincolnshire County Council in the list, for example. So these are things which are quite serious. What's interesting about that category of crime is that often the perpetrators are just kids. So you all know, I think, the Talk story, lots and lots of publicity about that. The guy who did that was a 15-year-old in Ballymena, who was, I think, having a laugh. He wasn't exactly what you call a hardened criminal, but the impact was very, very severe, and there is ongoing fraud that's being committed on the back of that, and Talk estimates £60 million that they've spent dealing with this, and there's been a lot of individual losses, including my dad, by the way, who was stung for £4,000 and he's not going to get it back. So these crimes, often perpetrated by quite minor offenders, but the impact on the public is extremely serious. Right at the top of this pyramid, though, we have a much, much smaller number of elite cyber criminals. Most of these that we know about are Russian-speaking, and most of those Russian speakers are based in Russia. And you don't need me to tell you that that does create challenges in terms of law enforcement cooperation in what is a very politically charged relationship that we have with the Russian state. We estimate that the financial losses, at least from that group of elite criminals, is the biggest impact altogether across all of the crime types. So what you see is this enormous range from the very, very sophisticated cyber criminals in very hard to reach places, very hard to identify, right down to a very, very high volume. So how does one configure a law enforcement response to deal with such a wide diversity of crime? So this is the strategy on a single slide that we recently agreed with the National Police Chiefs Council, ACPO, for those who prefer the old language. And this really establishes the 4 different things which we need to do to begin to bear down on this level of criminality. Now, the first thing we're focusing on here is the victims. So what do we need to do with victims? Well, the first thing is, as I'm sure anyone who's done any work on cybersecurity will tell you, that most of this crime can be prevented through very, very basic preventative measures, cybersecurity measures. But a lot of work's been done on what those measures should be, but that message simply isn't getting through to the citizen and to small business. So there's a lot more that we need to do collectively to get those messages across. There's a lot that the police can do to help that, because the police have got those local relationships and those business partnerships which can be used to really drive those messages home. The other thing we need to do about victims is be realistic, because actually there's a lot of different sorts of cybercrime out there, and it's actually quite a big ask on individual citizens, particularly people who are fairly new to technology, or people who've been grown up and educated in a world where the technology wasn't quite so ubiquitous. It's really hard to expect them to protect themselves against everything that can be thrown at them. So what is it that companies like the ISPs, the banks, the online retailers, what more can they do to protect their customers? And just as an example, I think the banks have done a very good thing. If you now walk into a bank branch, I guess we don't do that as often as we used to, there's a very simple list of these are the do's and don'ts, these are the things which we as the banking community have agreed we won't do. You've also got the beginning of ISPs offering value-added services to protect their customers better, and of course a lot of anti-fraud work that the banks do. We think there's a lot more that the sector can do, and we're working with them to, if we're seeing a cybercrime problem evolve, how can we get that intelligence to them quickly so they can do something to protect their customers? The final thing we need to do with victims is to say, well, if they do have a problem, is it clear what they should do? Is it clear what they can do to help themselves? And is it clear how they can call for assistance from law enforcement? Now, we do have as I said earlier, a single law enforcement reporting mechanism, Action Fraud, but the reality of it is that the experience that people have using that system is very mixed. And partly that's because of deficiencies in the system, and it's partly because the ability of individual police forces to actually respond to calls for action, to crime reporting, is limited because the capacity of the system as a whole is limited. So we need to do something about that. Now, I'm going to say something which is really, really obvious for any criminologists in the room, which is that if the risk and consequences of getting caught are low and the gains of a crime are high, then you're going to see growth in that crime area. It's pretty obvious. Well, the reality is, in this country at the moment, the risk of being caught and the consequences of being caught for committing cybercrime are perceived to be very, very low indeed. Actually, the reality is that they're not as low as people think they are, and there's a job on our side to do more to actually publicise what happens, the consequences of cybercrime. So our second strategic pillar here is all looking at UK offenders. Who are they? Where are they? What are they doing? How do they enter that criminal pathway? What can we do to prevent them from going down that path? Now, the reality is that there are few, if any, of the elite cyber criminals here in the UK. As I said, most of them are overseas. But if we go back to that pyramid, that middle tranche, we are oversupplied as a country with people in that kind of category, lower level criminals, or kids having a laugh who are actually causing a tremendous amount of damage. So the job on our side is to make sure we can identify those people, preferably identify them really, really early in their criminal evolution and give them a scare. And if they've actually gone onwards and have started doing more serious crimes, then we've got to make sure we can identify them and throw the entire criminal justice system against them. Now, we have done a reasonable job on that over the years. We've proven that we can identify people, we've proven that we can take them through the criminal justice system, and there's some pretty serious sentences coming out the other end. But the volume isn't there yet. And again, that's a capacity issue within policing, and it's an intelligence gap in terms of really being able to identify people early on in their criminal pathway. Now, that's the major UK-based groups, but as I said earlier, most of the harm is being committed by groups from overseas, and many of those individuals are in jurisdictions which are extremely difficult for us to operate in. So the third tranche is saying, okay, what can we do about this? Now, that is a multinational program. We can't do it just on our own, so we work extremely closely with allies, obviously in the US, obviously in Europe, and other countries dotted around the world, to try and create a coalition of capable law enforcement agencies that can go after these criminals. Often what we're finding is that it's quite hard to identify and disrupt the criminal themselves, so we have to look at their entire business model and say, okay, how are they committing the crime, how are they monetizing the benefit of that crime, and what are the points in which we're able to intervene. So, for example, they are dependent on pretty sophisticated IT infrastructure themselves, these so-called botnets and banking trojans and command and control, and all of that can be disrupted, and we have been disrupting that. They're critically dependent on networks of what are called money mulers, people who can actually monetize stolen information by transferring money or spending stolen credit cards. And a lot of those money people are actually based in the UK and Western Europe. So our theory is, in this part of the strategy, that if we can hit the money side really, really hard, then we will start to have an impact on the criminal business model. Ultimately, though, we do want to identify these people, we do want to catch them, and the good news is that they do make mistakes. So we have had a number of very high-profile arrests in various parts of Europe over the last 8 to 12 months because they have made mistakes. They've travelled, or they thought they were anonymous, and they weren't anonymous. The final bit of the strategy is called the International Cybercrime Marketplace. So what I mean by that is that some of the more capable criminals have actually decided to sell their services rather than just do the cybercrime directly. So if you think of things like ransomware or DDoS, are these terms that are familiar with people generally? So DDoS is where people will attack a business computer just to deny service. They'll swamp the website so no one else can get at it. Ransomware is where they'll lock the data on a computer and say you need to pay 500 quid, $500, whatever, for us to unlock that. Those are obviously quite potent, they're quite profitable, and they're available for sale as services on both the open internet and indeed what is called the dark web, the hidden internet. And there's a whole load of other specialist services within that criminal network that are available for hire. And that's what's bringing the cost of entry for cybercrime down. So if we can't somehow disrupt that market in cybercrime services, then we're never going to deal with that volume, that high volume, 2.5 million that we dealt with before. We also need to look at the supply side and say, well, what are the systemic vulnerabilities within the internet that are being exploited by criminals? Why is it possible to launch a DDoS attack? Why is it possible to infect someone's computer just by getting them to click on a link on an email, which seems crazy to me? So what can we do with the ecosystem providers, the big manufacturers, the people who run various parts of the internet? What can we do with them to begin to design out some of the vulnerabilities that exist? So I said I'd say a little bit about business. So the government is interacting with business in lots and lots of different ways, and it can be a very, very confused landscape if you're a medium-sized business here in Leeds and you're wondering, you know, where do I go to for help? So the purpose of this diagram is really to describe the different ways in which government and law enforcement are interacting with the business community. So right at the bottom here, it is the job of business to provide the best possible advice to business on how to protect themselves against cyber attack. There's a lot of good guidance out there, but as I said earlier, that guidance isn't necessarily being taken up. One of the questions I'm going to ask you later is, what can we do to increase the take-up there? That collectively is what is called information assurance. All the things that you can do to protect yourselves. The next thing which government does with business is to share information about what threats are out there, what vulnerabilities are out there. There's a system for doing that called the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Partnership, which is what CISP stands for. It's a very, very good system. It provides people whose job it is to defend computer networks with the very latest information about what problems are out there. But the bad news is there aren't enough members in it. I think it's about 2,000 companies members at the national level, and I think, Stu, you said about 50 at the regional level in Yorks and Humberside out of 250,000 businesses. So there's clearly an issue in terms of take-up there. What can we do to encourage take-up of that? All of that is about companies being in a better position to defend themselves. My big pitch to business has been that that's not enough. If all a business does is defend itself, then the criminals are just going to come back every day and beat at that door until there's a way through. So we have to find a way of actually opening our door, going out onto the street and actually feeling the collars of the criminals themselves. There has to be a deterrent element in that. But to do that, we need access to the intelligence that those companies actually hold. Because often they're very reluctant to share with policing because they're worried about their reputation. They don't want to admit that they've been subject to a crime. And a lot of the valuable data that they have, which we could use to help us identify and catch those criminals, is locked up within their systems. So we need them to do more to provide that upstream intelligence. And ultimately our aim is to disrupt those criminals, and actually the capability that exists within the bigger companies, within the big banks, within the specialist security providers, the Symantec's and Sophos and Kaspersky's of this world. There's a huge amount of capability that we can use to actually disrupt the criminals, particularly the criminal infrastructure itself. I'm hoping that this will let me go backwards. So, let me finish by saying what you can do for me. Because there are a number of difficult challenges, and I'm going to describe some of these under each of the headings, and then I'm hoping we can have a bit of a discussion. Any questions you want to throw at me, but also ideas about how do we begin to tackle some of this. So if we start with victims, the challenge I have is that I've got the message in terms of what victims have to do to protect themselves, but I can't get that message across. So what is it, from a behavioural science point of view, what is it that we have to do to actually get what are fairly simple messages through to the public at large? What kind of mixture of national, local activities? What's actually going to make the difference? What has made the difference in the past in terms of other crime prevention or public safety messaging? So there's a lot of research that can be done in that field. The second one, and this relates to the point about action fraud. What expectations do the public actually have of law enforcement? What do they think law enforcement's job is? And what confidence do they have or not have in police's ability to actually respond to the crimes that they care about? My sense is that there's a lot of dissatisfaction out there. But what is a reasonable expectation for them to have? Because if there's 2.5 million cybercrimes going on, there is not capacity within law enforcement to deal with that. So where do we draw the line, and how do we get that compact with the public that is a reasonable expectation in terms of what they're getting for their local taxes and national taxes? And then the final one, and this is really again for the statisticians in the room. It's very, very difficult getting a handle on what is the actual harm that cybercrime is creating for our economy and our society. Lots of people have tried to produce a single number, and I don't believe any of the single numbers I've been given. But I think that's a fool's errand, if you like. But I think there is stuff that we could do to find a better taxonomy, a better methodology for measuring the harm of individual things. So if you have a big banking Trojan like Drydex or Game Over's Use, just to name a couple, then what is the total harm? How can we measure that in a consistent way? If we look at the offenders, the UK offenders, I talked about early stage interventions. So what do we know about the pathways that criminals are actually taking? Where do people start out as cyber criminals? What is it that takes them on that pathway? There has been some really good work on this. There was a report that an organisation called CREST, C-R-E-S-T, did with us in the NCA a few months ago that began to set out some of the science about those criminal pathways and some of the points where we could intervene to have effect. But the research is very, very young in that field, so more on really understanding the psychology of the cyber criminal and what are the interventions that we can use to deal with that. The other area, and maybe this is for the more technically minded, is what investigative tools can we develop for actually identifying and attributing these attacks. Attribution is the big word used for cybercrime, and attribution is really, really difficult because the criminals are smart and they try and hide behind multiple levels of anonymity. But actually it's very hard to be anonymous completely in the internet, but it generally takes a lot of work to investigate. The guy who was behind the TalkTalk attack, it didn't take very long to work out who he was. But how can we scale that? What kind of tools can we get? Some of you will have heard of Bitcoin and Bitcoin wallets. What tools can we use to actually analyse those wallets and actually get from a financial transaction to a real human being? So there's lots and lots of scope for investigative action. Big data meets law enforcement, that's where we want to be. There's another area for those who are working perhaps in more traditional crime types is, well, what is the overlap between some of the traditional crimes of drug smuggling and human trafficking and so on, and gun running, money laundering? To what extent are those sorts of gangs getting into cybercrime, or at least buying services off that marketplace I mentioned before? And we're beginning to see some evidence of the Russian cyber criminals actually marketing their wares to organised criminal groups here in the UK because, you know, they know how to monetize, they know how to money launder, which is the one area that the Russian-speaking criminals are weaker at. So what are the overlaps and the relationships between cybercrime and, if you like, traditional crime. Similar story overseas. These small number of elite cyber criminals are making a massive, massive amount of money. How are they doing it? What is their business model? What are the vulnerabilities within that business model that we could exploit? And similarly, in terms of the cybercrime marketplace, how does it operate? How does money flow? How do people learn to trust each other when they're buying and selling services? Some of these services have customer rating things, just like you see on eBay. You know, yes, I use this DDoS, the sort of trip advisor for cyber criminals, if you like. So how does that work, and how can we disrupt that? How can we sow mistrust in that market, which is always a good way of degenerating a marketplace? And then there are a number of cross-cutting areas. I'll name three. The first is, so what is it that we can do? How can we incentivize some of the big companies, the Apples and Googles and Microsofts and BTs of this world, to actually start implementing some of the security standards that we know are out there in order to reduce some of the vulnerability? I'm going to, if you're not technical, just check your emails or something. But a great example of this is something called DMARC, which is something that email providers can implement, and if they implement it, it's very difficult to spoof that email domain. And therefore it's very hard to do these phishing attacks, which are often the vector by which people attack people. Everyone knows how to prevent that from happening, but no one has actually implemented that solution because it's a hassle and because it costs a bit of money. So it's really a question for the economists as much as it is a question for the technologists in terms of how do we actually promote some of these standards. The next one is much more for the international relations or social science types. One of the problems that we have is that there are some countries who are able and willing to cooperate in the fight against cybercrime, and there are some countries who aren't. Either aren't willing to invest in the capability that they need, or incapable of investing in the capability they need, or simply unwilling to work with us because they see the criminals in their jurisdiction attacking victims in our jurisdiction. So where's the incentive to actually do something about it? So the question there is one of an international relations question. How does one create incentives? How does one create what we used to call in the Foreign Office norms of behaviour, standards by which individual countries can be expected to follow? And how can we create an environment where there are incentives on countries to do the right thing and disincentives for them to either do nothing or do the wrong thing? And then finally, for those who like working in a multidisciplinary way, when we add all of these different aspects of the strategy, how can we direct them on specific problems like ransomware and DDoS and actually have an effect? Because no single intervention against any of those things is going to make a difference. So just if I would summarise before opening up, this is a very, very broad range of crime that we have here, from the very, very elite, high harm, to the very high volume, sometimes low harm, but sometimes life-changing. And we require a very broad strategy to deal with that. We've got a strategy that looks at this problem from a victims and offenders point of view, looks at it from a national and international point of view. I think it's the right strategy, but there's a lot of gaps and questions in that. We really need to change the way that we're working with business from one which is mostly focused on how to protect yourself. Well, it should always be mostly focused on that, but which also includes how can you work with law enforcement to actually help us create some real disincentives and some disruption on the criminality. And then finally, there's lots and lots of things, unanswered questions that we have, which I think are absolutely ripe for research topics, and we'll be working, we're very happy to work with supervisors and students who've really got a good idea that can help us solve this problem. I should say at this point that Leeds is one of the universities that has won an EPSRC grant to help pay for this, that David is managing that within this university with Durham and Newcastle, and Steve from Durham. So there is, I think, at least some funding available to support this work, which I'm told is quite important in this environment. So I'll stop there. And are there any comments, questions, suggestions for improvements, or ideas for what the research community can do to make my life better?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I found it very interesting. It's not something I know very much about, so it's really good to be able to have this lecture. I'm interested in your point about how can you get the public, the message across to the public, the ordinary public. One can understand the big problems of the banks, the data, etc., being stolen. But for the ordinary public, just the ordinary person man in the street, presumably their engagement with the internet is online shopping of various types. So that's the thing you've got to get them to understand, that this is where the problem lies. And I'm not sure, if that's actually the case. There's a big gap, isn't there, between the problem with the banks and TalkTalk and the ordinary person doing a few bits of online shopping. So how do you make that connection between the two and relate the messages to ordinary people?
So, and TalkTalk's a really interesting case. The actual hack that was well publicised into TalkTalk was actually fairly trivial in terms of the damage caused. The numbers of people whose personal information was stolen was quite small. The problem was that the enormous amount of publicity about that, the fact that some customers' details had already been stolen some time before, actually gave the in for a lot of fraudsters to then do telephone fraud. My dad fell for telephone fraud, not for cybercrime, effectively. So I think there's two things. I think first we have to be realistic about what individuals can do, because it is quite complicated. And we do have to, I think, insist on the companies doing more to support those individuals. When it comes to individuals, I think we need a very, very small number of very simple messages. Now, some work has been done on the big three, as they're called. Make sure you have a good password. Make sure you have up-to-date software. Invest in the right sort of antivirus type capability. But I don't think that's right, because actually often people are just being duped. I mean, they do need to do those things, but I think some of the anti-fraud measures are just as important. So, when my dad fell for that, and he's a pretty switched-on 82-year-old, he should not have been duped like this. He basically believed what someone was telling him on the phone, and believed that a company like TalkTalk would ask him to do things which they would never ever have asked him to do. So I think we need to get the companies to worry about the technology bits and focus the public messaging on the human bits, if you like. And I don't know what you think, Stu, but I think we were discussing earlier, the messaging is a bit, doesn't quite land.
I think the marketing, cyber streetwise, for example, is well out of date.
Yeah.
And needs refreshing to be realistic in what's going on now. Can I just finish off your comments about TalkTalk? One of the issues for me with TalkTalk was that on the sort of the night before, the CEO, Dido Harding, was sat having a nice Chianti, enjoying herself. The following morning, she was on the front page, and the media wanted to know everything about her life, the children and everything else that was going on. And I think that's the message that hasn't got across to CEOs in this country yet, that if something goes wrong, you won't be able to get the media to deal with it. It's you as an individual that will have to be dealing with those problems. And I think once that message gets across, then you'll see it start to transcend down. But I agree with you, it's not just about passwords, it's also about the way that you behave online and the way in which you do things that make you vulnerable to social engineering, like your father being told things that are untrue, but that he believes to be true, and then acting on behalf of it.
Surely one aspect of government policy should be then to make antivirus software available free, because it costs. And people don't.
But it is available free.
It is available.
Sorry?
Yeah, I mean, it is.
free.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
through the Microsoft Defender, the
Yeah.
basic stuff is there.
Oh, the basic stuff. You presumably need something more sophisticated.
Well, I think, I mean, Microsoft are pretty good. I don't think the quality of the software available is the issue. I think some people just ignore it anyway, but I just think we need to, the idea that an individual citizen, average person can actually technically defend themselves, I think is unrealistic. And I think we have to place a lot more demand on the companies to do that bit. And then focus with people on the human side, because there's plenty of, and I think you're seeing that. I mean, I think some of the attacks are getting more engineered. They are based on duping people, getting them to give up information, because obviously a password is, well, I mean, there are things one needs to do with passwords, to make them better. But ultimately, if you can persuade someone to give it up anyway, then it doesn't matter how secure it is. So, I mean, I don't have all the answers to this. I think we need a simple message that's based on behavioural issues rather than technical issues, and then we need to place a lot greater burden on the companies. But of course, the companies are only going to do that if their customers ask for it. So in a way, the message should be a more demanding customer of your ISP. Make decisions in terms of, you're locking up a huge amount of value of your life and your personal life and your money in your device and the services you're being provided. So you should be more demanding in terms of saying, what are you doing to secure me? That's what will make a difference.
Just one final point. I think you could pass the message to students, to kids, schools, because they use the internet a lot.
Yeah.
Through the children, you get message to parents as well.
Yeah.
Can I chip in there? I mean, one advert which I find really interesting is the Barclays advert. Where a person comes on and says, "My name is Frank," and the person behind said, "No, it isn't. He's a scammer." And actually, I was rung up the other day, and that actually gave me a narrative by which to respond to the scammer. This person said, "I'm ringing from Microsoft. You've got something on your computer." I said, "No, you haven't." I said, "Prove it." And that actually gave me, I mean, I should know all this stuff, but no, this actually gave me a narrative to follow. So, perhaps the sort of public service broadcast might be one way of approaching the social engineering side of things.
You're also adding friction for the criminal. You're slowing them down.
Yes.
Which is also a good thing.
Yes.
The cybercrime phenomenon is very kind of diverse, with the way a manner the crime is being perpetrated. It cannot be seen in two phases. There are some victims that are just purely victims of phishing, for example. Whereas some victims are purely victims of the social engineering, interaction on the internet. And the research has shown that the victims of those who are victims of the social engineering and people who can come with suit words and looking for spouse and the rest of it, they are always like victims of their own circumstances. And at a point in time, some of them even actually believe the offender more than the law enforcement agency. So what can we do in terms of improving the kind of trust, building trust within the offenders and the law enforcement agency? Because that's pretty cool. I mean, that would be a very good strategy. Looking at that particular aspect of cybercrime related like 419 or
Yeah.
advanced fraud related. People want to hang where they do not reap, and therefore they fall victims of circumstance.
Yeah.
So what can the kind of argument should be looking at what can we do to build relationship between the offenders and the law enforcement who are really dealing with the crime, and how much work as a National Crime Agency done in terms of talking to the general public, the need for them to have trust in the criminal justice system as compared to having more trust in the offender himself. Because my research also showed that there is a particular case whereby the law enforcement agency look at the door of the victim that the money that you're going to receive from Nigeria is no money here. Don't send this money. And the offender communicated back to them, they don't want you to be rich.
Yeah.
Send this money in the name of somebody, like if my name is Emmanuel, just send it with my surname.
Yeah.
So therefore, you cannot really trace the financial flow from the law enforcement agency. It will be as if a younger brother is sending money to, an elder brother in Nigeria. So it's a lot of trust between the criminal justice system and the offender themselves. So we need to look at that.
Let me just in case folks over this side didn't hear that in this room. So it's really the challenge is people get sucked into these scams and end up believing the scammer more than they believe the law enforcement officer. And of course that's not new, and it's a big problem with romance fraud as well, which is terrible, very cynical kind of thing for people to do. I think what makes it worse and more challenging with the internet is the scale. So it's like a 419 scam, but done 1,000 times as much. And people do get sucked in and duped. But I think the actual answer has to be the same. It has to be very, very simple and basic advice, to against people getting drawn into this. If it's my colleague in the City of London Police, who lead on the policing response to fraud, at the end of his emails, he just simply has a little thing that says, if it looks too good to be true, then it is too good to be true. There's some very, very simple messaging like that. I think the other thing we have to do is we do have to make sure that the response when people do approach the police is much quicker and more effective than it is now, because the system just isn't fast enough. And then I think we on the law enforcement side do need to do more to publicise when we've had successes against this, because the impression out there is that there's no point contacting the police. My dad called me last week, a week before I think it was, and said, just to let you know, he said, a very nice phone call from West Mercia Police. I don't know why, he lives in Oxfordshire, but he got a call from West Mercia looking at the crime that you suffered, just give us a bit more information. And he still doesn't think he'll get his money back, but he's now got more confidence in the system. And I think the statistics, I looked at the statistics of that 2.5 million cyber-related crimes. The number of pure cyber crimes reported was 16,500, which is tiny compared to 2.5 million. But actually there were 700,000 cyber-enabled frauds, as they're called, i.e., not pure hacking job, but using the computer to defraud you. And actually that's not a bad number, 700,000. So we are beginning to get people to report, but we do need to do more, and we need to show that it's worth doing, that there will be a response.
I think you're right about education, the importance of education and educating people about potential risk. But I suppose those sort of sense go up a level. How does one engage companies more in this? There's not a lot of incentives at the moment on companies, I suppose, to actually do anything about it. Your father's interesting point you made about shaming CEOs. That's one thing. It's all a bit remote. One method might be to think about having a default position in the case of your middle group of companies, that if essentially as a result of you being the subject of a cybercrime, a cyber attack, people like your father have been defrauded, then you pay compensation, so the company, TalkTalk, pays compensation to the father. Now that is going to put TalkTalk in a position where it's going to do its very best to educate people like your father about the ways in which they might be scammed.
I think, again, this is a really good question for economists and business schools to say, so where does one draw the line then? Because I've heard equally cogent arguments to say part of the problem, the reason that people don't adopt basic cybersecurity measures is they know the banks will get them their money back, which actually isn't always true. So we kind of, at one end one could say, well actually liability should stay with the citizen because then they'll actually take a bit more care. And at the other end you can say liability should always be with the company because then they'll take extra measures to protect their customers. It's somewhere in the middle. Where it should be in the middle, I think, is not terribly clear, and that's why I think some useful research in that area. You know, there's a bell curve, isn't there, somehow? What's that sweet spot that we should be aiming for? But I tell you, we're not at that sweet spot now, I'm pretty sure about that. Yes?
Yeah, just going back to the point about companies, I've been before my previous job, I worked in a financial crime team for LB Insurance. Before that, I was in the counter-fraud department for RBS. I think the biggest thing for these companies is reputational risk. That's what they preach, like massively. Yeah. They're bothered about reputational risk. Economic risk they can manage. Reputational risk is what they're most scared of. So you saw how TalkTalk got absolutely hammered in the press, and I think they'll be looking to avoid that at all costs. Yeah. They put aside, I know particularly RBS, budgeted to be breached and pay compensation. Yeah. You talked about paying people compensation. I can tell you now, RBS lose loads of data all the time, some through conventional means, like people leaving laptops on taxis, leaving folders on trains. They're set up to compensate people that suffer losses. They will put billions aside to pay compensation, and I bet a lot of the cybercrime and cyber breaches go unreported because companies like RBS and LV spend so much time and effort and money developing a brand saying that this is a safe place to do business. They'd rather pay monetary compensation so that people don't complain to the police, don't go to the media to say this has happened to me, and sweep it all up under the carpet. And going back to consumers kicking off a fuss, if more consumers that were victims probably kicked off a fuss, said this happened to me, you might get somewhere with them. But I think at the moment, masses gets unreported, and I think there's no real incentive for the banks and insurance companies and other companies out there that hold a lot of customer data. And I mean, these banks, major companies, can tell you so much about people's habits. They spend loads on market research. I mean, at LV before I left, they were doing lots of research in terms of demographics, using software developed by Semantics on profiling, customer profiling, demographics, people's movements. They were monitoring effectively customers joining and leaving LV, their spending habits. They hold so much data on people. A lot of people don't realise how much they spend on researching people, and all of that's held, and the reputational risk of that getting it out that they might have lost that data, and they do lose it. They hold so much data, they lose it all the time, but it doesn't get reported because they'll pay that compensation, whatever it takes, to prevent a talk situation happening.
So this is a really powerful point. Can I use it to just sort of expand a bit on this? Because that's absolutely right. I mean, the companies we talk to, their first objective is brand protection, their second objective is clearing up what's happened to them, and the third by quite a long way is protecting their customers, and then the final one is actually working with us to try and help catch the criminals that did it. But at the same time, a lot of the companies, including RBS by the way, are actually looking at this and saying this is now a mug's game for two reasons. First, they keep losing more and more money and having to spend more and more money in defending themselves. And also the confidence of their customers in digital banking is beginning to take a knock. And of course the real money is to be made by closing branches, to be cynical. The problem we've got, and we've had this conversation with the banks and with a lot of the more specialist consultants, who will do the kind of cleanups afterwards. Part of the problem is that it's a bit binary, the decision, as they see it. Either you report something to the police and you're the next Dido Harding, or you don't tell anyone and the criminals get away with it. The reason for establishing this diagram here, which is one I've used a lot with the banks, is to say that when you're working with us up here in the intelligence part of that, we can actually do that in a very discreet way. So let's say you're RBS, just for the sake of argument, that you have seen a lot of activity, you've had to sort of pay out some compensation, you've had to recover breaches and stuff. They are actually willing now to talk to us and say, we can provide you some indicators here of some of the methodologies and the criminal groups behind that. We've had some real successes in this recently with the banks on the cashing out side, where they said, yes, this money's gone, this money's been